And here you have a great quote that I think that encapsulates this: the removal of noxious physical circumstances and the promotion of civic, household and personal cleanliness are necessary to the improvement of the moral condition of the population. Okay, so now civility and health and sanitation are inextricably linked, and that meant to be unsanitary, to be of poor health or dirty, was an uncivil thing to do, had become now morally inappropriate. Okay. After Chadwick's report, what you have then, just as with the Poor Law, is the creation of a commission, the Health of Towns Commission in 1844, and then, just as the Poor Law Commission led to the new Poor Law, the creation of a Public Health Act in 1848. Now, you have a central board of health in London, okay, and then you have local boards of health that are meant to do its work, enact its work. But the problem was that in 1848, people had become so unenamored by the centralisation of power under the Poor Law that the Public Health Act was passed on a voluntary basis. And a lot of legislation in the 19th century was passed on this thing. If you like, it was an enabling type of legislation. It would say to localities, we're providing you with a framework to be able to do this, but it's up to you. Your taxpayers, your inhabitants have to vote to pass this. But you would get a local board of health if only 10% of the population petitioned for one, or if your death rate, the death rate of that locality was very high, then it was made compulsory. What happens is that public health legislation becomes more and more compulsory. That the voluntary nature of the 1848 Act was seen to have basically failed. And so you have a series of steps in which in 1866 local boards of health are made responsible for the provision of sewers, the provision of clean waters. This is the era of massive reservoir building to provide clean drinking water to the new urban centres, for street cleaning, and for making sure that all houses are connected to sewers, and for appointing government sanitary inspectors for doing this work. Now, what I want to suggest to you here is that you have, from the 1840s up through the 1890s, 1900s even, the creation of a completely new infrastructure of the state around sanitary issues. So you have drains and sewers, you have reservoirs, you have public toilets, you have discrete burial places, you even have abattoirs. Okay, you have the widening and lighting of streets, and you have things designed to reduce noise pollution and air pollution. Okay. Now, basically, what I'm suggesting to you is this infrastructure, okay, in the space of about 50 years, becomes part of the sort of natural order of things. That people didn't think of the state when they turned on their tap, but it was the state that was doing that work. People didn't think of the state when they flushed their toilets, but it was actually the state enabling them to, get rid of their crap and for it to be sent under the street and out into a sewage treatment plant. In fact, one of the guiding principles of all of this sanitary infrastructure is to try and make natural bodily functions as occluded as possible. So abattoirs were there to take, blood and flesh off the streets. Okay? Sewer system was to make sure that, urine and crap were no longer seen floating down the street. Crematoriums were there to make sure that dead bodies didn't keep popping out of graveyards because they'd been so overpopulated. Okay, so there was a way in which this sanitary infrastructure makes an entirely new set of conditions in which the human body, new set of relations to the human body, and it creates a new set of behaviours as a consequence. And I want to use what we Americans charmingly call the urinal which Brits describe as a urinal, as an example of this. Here you have an image of Jennings's public urinal, which was patented and sold to a whole bunch of local authorities in the 1880s and 1890s. Many of you will have stumbled across some of the still working urinals in London. Many of them are underground and have elaborate iron railings around them. Now, the point about the creation of the urinal, okay, and its central historical importance to this course, is that after this, it becomes completely illegitimate and uncivil and unliberal to be seen to be pissing in the street. Okay? Up until this point, if one needed to piss, one pissed. Okay? You didn't have to go and run away to some place to hide. You would just do it in public. My 6-year-old still, I'm delighted to say, is happy to do this. After the public urinal, you have to go into a discrete, enclosed, often underground space to be able to pass water, or God forbid, anything worse than that. And interestingly, one of the big things here was that public urinals were not provided for women. Okay? It was very early in the 20th century that women had public toilets, which was why department stores, when they first opened, were one of the key refuges for women out and about in public places, because they provided places where you could go and relieve yourself. The other point that I want to make about public urinals, okay, you'd be amazed how many things I can say about public urinals, is that, of course, they also become sites of increasingly of behaviour increasingly defined as illicit. Okay, so for instance, many of the big underground public urinals in London, particularly in the West End, become a key meeting place for men looking for same-sex encounters. Okay, so it becomes a key place in which the policing of same-sex relations between men gets enacted in the 20th. Actually, almost pretty much throughout the 20th century up to the 1960s. So it's a very good example, the urinal, I think, in how this new set of state activities creates a new set of expectations of behaviour, of how to be civil, how to be healthy, how to be a good liberal person. Okay? And you wouldn't think that the state, when you go into a urinal, you're not thinking, it's the state that's provided me this refuge, but it is. You're governed in ways in which you don't know. I'm not going to do education. I've been talking far too much. Does anyone have any questions about, please, a question about a urinal, or indeed anything else on the public health front? Yeah.
Sure. So before houses were hooked up to sewers,
you would have you'd have ash pits, you'd have buckets.
they have dunning in, where it was in Australia.
What's a Dunnyman?
The woman came with a big thing on his back, and he was
No, I mean, I was going to be rude and say no. Of course, that's just the Australians, but actually, many countries did this thing of recycling human waste and selling it for agricultural purposes. That wasn't such a big deal in British cities, but it was in many cities around the world. So no, there wasn't a lot of recycling in that way. Most of the excrement literally went down streets and was drained into the various rivers or streams that ran through British cities. I mean, obviously, if you live in the country, it's not, there are holes and, lots of that type of stuff. But yeah, yes. And your name? Catherine.
I don't know, it's really thrown off by the no public, or, like, information, like, what are the
You're speechless, aren't you? So Catherine is speechless about the fact that there was no public restroom, as we call it here, for women, and what's the logic behind it. The logic was very simple. It was that women basically shouldn't be out in public space, and that to be out in, and I'll talk about this next week, that to be out in public space was somehow to suggest that you were, of lapsed moral character, and therefore basically, almost a whore. Of course, there were sanctioned public spaces where it was fine and where public restrooms were provided. But in terms of street life, it wasn't really appropriate for women to be out, genteel women to be out on the streets. And for the rest of them, well, they're uncivil and unsanitary anyway. Someone down here had a question. No? Yes? Oh, when did urinals become popular? I think that the construction of public urinals really begins in the 1870s, but gets busy from the 1880s and 1890s. Have any of you been to one of those elaborate, ornate Victorian public urinals in London that are underground? Yeah, no, they've all been closed down now. Bars? Right. Yes, and they look a little like the TARDIS, don't they, in Doctor Who? I can never, I'm always scared of going into one of those in case, I'm whisked off by the good doctor somewhere. Anyway, it seems just very hard to operate those things, Whereas the public urinals often used to have an attendant, and you'd, and it seemed, anyway. Railway stations were another good place that provided public restrooms. Okay, so a couple of things in conclusion. First is, of course, that I'm trying to describe to you a new type of state, a new type of Leviathan, which is not simply about the monopoly of power and violence, but about, if you like, the dispersion of authority and its operation through increasingly bureaucratic and anonymous and procedural forms. Okay, there's not just a new philosophy of government that emerges in the middle of the 19th century, but a new operation of government, a new practice of statecraft, which is profoundly novel and yet now profoundly familiar. The second point that I wanted to make is to emphasize in a way that I didn't really, I think, do a good enough job on, in that interventions like the New Poor Law and public health exemplify this liberal paradox of having to govern people to make them free. So the state has to actively intervene upon paupers, has to provide this huge infrastructure of workhouses, etc., in order to transform the poor into good liberal people. And the same is true of public health. Okay? You only become an object of state intervention if you are unsanitary, if you are poor, if in some way you are seen to be failed. The other point I was obviously making was that one of the reasons in which, again, this very interventionist state, and in a way quite a violent type of